in trying to give you a sense about why I work for peace and disarmament, I thought I would actually take you back in time a little bit to a Sunday evening late in November in 1983. I had snuck down the stairs and I told my parents that I wasn't feeling well. But what my 7-year-old self was actually doing is that this was a ruse to get my parents to let me join them and my siblings as they were preparing to watch a movie on TV. So they let me stay, and what my parents had tuned into that night, along with 100 million other Americans, was the movie The Day After. And this movie has had a tremendous impact on me because I really remember, as I peeked out from underneath the blanket and was supposed to be sleeping, but I remember the images from this movie. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a fictitious story of conflict between the Warsaw Pact countries and NATO, and it escalates to a full-scale nuclear weapons exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. I would learn 30 years later that the creators of this film did a lot of work to make sure that they were really accurately depicting what the effects would be of a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons being detonated. However, some of the special effects had to be scaled back because they were deemed to be too disturbing to the general population. My parents they've put a tremendous emphasis on education, so I wasn't surprised to know that they had gathered my brother and sister and that they were tuning in that night. Nor was it surprising 8 years later when I found myself as a delegate at my first Model United Nations conference. I don't know how many of you have ever done that, but it's had a tremendous impact on me. It was a real opportunity to think about what are these big issues that are transnational and how can governments work together to tackle them. I carried this passion with me into university, where I still did Model United Nations as an extracurricular activity. And one of the most sought after assignments was to chair the first committee at Model UN, and that's the Disarmament Committee. So I have this thread that goes through my early years of my life. And I would learn later in graduate school that international organizations like the UN have tremendous challenges. And I had decided to go to graduate school after a career in the private sector because I was really trying to think about how to get back to issues that really had my heart and mind. So as I went to graduate school, I got a master's in international affairs, and I thought about kind of where I could make my best contribution. And part of my background and what my family has inculcated in me is the idea that when you've had the privilege of a wonderful education, how do you really apply yourself to the toughest problems? So I decided that nuclear weapons would be an easy place to start. And thankfully, I was really lucky to have a 12-year career in doing nuclear weapons policy work before I came to The Hague 2 years ago. My work was primarily outside of government, but working with governments. I worked with the community of civil society organizations. So these are think tanks, these are policy institutions, these are grassroots organizations, people who do public interest lobbying, and the foundations that fund them. I worked with a community that was focused on influencing US nuclear weapons policy. And that was tremendous exposure for me to understand that there are entities outside of government that can either increase or decrease the space for better or worse policy outcomes. And what it really struck home was the idea that it's understandable that citizens, they care more about their day-to-day concerns, and they think that governments are doing everything they can to tackle these grave threats. Unfortunately, people, even the best intentioned people in government, are usually putting out fires day to day. They don't have the time to do long timeline thinking or to think about non-traditional approaches to what sometimes seem like intractable problems. From the work I was able to do in think tanks and policy institutions, I really had a chance to work with governments. And what I found in my experience is that when you don't have this idea of pride of ownership, where you can instead work collaboratively with other people, and you could really get a lot further in terms of policy outcomes because governments will take up ideas as their own and they'll implement it. I feel particularly honored and actually extremely humbled to be asked to talk about what I've done with my life so far in the broader context of Bertha von Suttner's legacy. And it's a groundbreaking legacy, as she was not only the woman who advocated for there being a Nobel Peace Prize, but she was, as we heard earlier, the first woman to win it. That's a pretty awesome legacy to have, and particularly at the earliest part of the 20th century. There have been traces, as I've learned more about Bertha, there have been some traces in her approach that I can see in my own work, and that is not to, again, I feel very humbled to make this comparison. One thing that Bertha did in her activism is that she was involved in the Hague Peace Conference of 1899, and she was the only woman who was allowed in, and what she did is she adopted an approach of having these salons where she would invite in diplomats and journalists. And that was, I think, a really great way at that time to try to influence and inform the deliberations that were happening. I can really relate to that because that's a lot of how I do my work. It's not always, even though I'm a spokesperson now, it's not always things that are in front of the camera or in front of the public. Oftentimes it's the very careful policy work and trying to get other people to adopt your ideas. Another part of where I see kind of Bertha's legacy is that she really believed in the power of treaties. And she died in June of 1914. That was 1 month before World War I broke out. Had she lived a year longer, she, along with the rest of the world, would have witnessed the first large-scale use of chemical weapons. And it happened not too far from here in Ypres, Belgium, in April of 1915. 75 years later, thankfully, governments were able to get together, and the Chemical Weapons Convention was born, and enshrined in it is a comprehensive prohibition against chemical weapons, against the use of chemical weapons, its transfer, stockpiling, et cetera. And when the Chemical Weapons Convention came into force, the OPCW was born, so that's the organization I work for. We are responsible for the oversight and implementation of the convention. 100 years, more than 100 years now after that first use of chemical weapons in Ypres, unfortunately, chemical weapons are far too relevant. They dominate our headlines, and for all the wrong reasons. In 2013, the OPCW received the Nobel Peace Prize for its extensive work in eliminating chemical weapons. And I should say that there has been concrete progress made in the implementation of this convention over 2 decades. As an example, over 96% of the chemical weapons stockpiles that have been declared have been verifiably eliminated. But as I said, unfortunately, chemical weapons are in the news far too often and for the wrong reasons. So clearly there's more work to be done. I joined the OPCW 3 years after it received the Nobel Peace Prize, so there should be no correlation between my work and the work of the OPCW. And my job is to make sure that there is accurate information about the work of the OPCW and that we are conveying the relevance of its mission. I understand that there's some of you in the audience who are probably thinking about different steps you may take in your career and maybe thinking about how can you contribute to big issues like this. And what I'd like you to take away from what I've shared with you today is that if you're passionate about issues and if you can think creatively about different ways of getting involved, you can be in government, you can be outside of government, you can work for these large organizations, you can be in the grassroots. There's a way and there's a need for everybody to try to contribute, and to the extent that they can. Having an awareness of these issues is actually a contribution, because when we forget about what we're fighting for, that I think is where there's a real challenge. And we see then the erosion of what has been a near global agreement that these weapons are never to be used again. So what I can tell you from working inside the OPCW is that we absolutely are looking for the next generation of diplomats and scientists and linguists and inspectors. So if you think that you're good at languages, great. Think about being a linguist. If you like doing chemistry, there's a way to do that. Are you really good at planning things? We need people who can do logistics and prepare our inspectors to go on missions. So there's a variety of ways for everybody to contribute. But in the meantime, I will say this, that this goal of permanently eliminating chemical weapons, it's a complex one, and it takes very committed people to see it through. For my own sake, I'm very proud to even make my small contribution to this goal. And even as we have made large strides towards that goal, unfortunately, there's still more work to be done. And maybe some of you will join us in doing that work. Thank you very much.